So hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today for this important discussion. My name is Lauren Oates, and I'm Executive Director of Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan. We're an organization that exists to make the right to learn a reality for Afghan women and girls. We provide quality, gender equitable educational programs and access to educational opportunities that foster agency, dignity, and choice. We're pleased to be hosting this panel today on a topic of great interest and really urgent relevance to us for our own work for Afghan women. This event is a parallel session to the 68th UN Commission on the Status of Women. Their theme this year is accelerating the achievement of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls by addressing poverty and strengthening institutions and financing with a gender perspective. So just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. This event is being recorded for those who are unable to be with us today, and the link will be available on our YouTube channel and shared via a follow-up email. And time permitting, you'll have the opportunity to put questions to our speakers toward the end of the session. So kindly use the Q&A function on your screen for that. So today's discussion is on the right to education for Afghan women and girls. Sorry, that's our work. So I'm used to saying that. It's the right to education for women and girls affected by displacement and crisis, wherever that may be, exploring international obligations, innovations, and good practices. So we will be looking at situations where education is suspended, either due to emergencies or to crisis or conflict, or in the case of Afghanistan, where the state denies access to education. We'll be looking at what resources are being utilized to bridge the education gap, but also how to ensure these resources are human rights centered and gender responsive. So this session is really about possibility. We know the problem well. Today is about what can change and how, and what is already changing. And we have an amazing lineup of speakers joining us today. I'm Nick Sabato, Senior Director with Education for Humanity at Arizona State University. Lauren Gherkin, Gender Coordinator with International Network for Education, or INEE. Hawa Abdiaziz, Communication Coordinator with She Leads Kakuma. And Frances Randall, Connected Higher Education Specialist with the UNHCR. Frances has kindly agreed to share some opening remarks. Frances Randall is UNHCR's Connected Higher Education Specialist based at UNHCR's Education Headquarters in Copenhagen. He represents UNHCR as the co-lead of the Connected Learning and Crisis Consortium and works with partners to bring higher education to communities where refugees are hosted. So over to you, Frances.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
I can see my camera's not working, so let me just see if I can get it to turn on. Ah, there we go. Okay, great. Thank you so much for the very generous introduction, Lauren. It's a pleasure to be here on this webinar on this critical topic. And as Lauren mentioned, I'm working for UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. And so to kind of set the scene a little bit, I thought I would give some context in terms of, first of all, UNHCR's role in education, but also in promoting gender inclusion, and then also to just point to a couple of directions around innovation in terms of digital learning for women and girls. So I'll try to keep my opening remarks brief, and then we can go further into these issues as we talk through this. So just to clarify, UNHCR is, as I mentioned, is the UN Refugee Agency. So we're talking about a population of refugees. There are nearly 15 million refugee children of school age under the UNHCR mandate, and of those 51% are out of school. So that's more than 7 million children who are missing out on education. And when it comes to enrollment in education, the rates of enrollments for refugees are consistently lower than those of national populations. So refugee enrollment rates at pre-primary, primary, secondary and tertiary are all lower than national populations, and the situation worsens as you go up the education cycle. So when it comes to tertiary education, for example, we see that only 7% of refugees are enrolled, as opposed to a 40% global average. And so this is just to point out that the rates of enrollments for refugees are lower at all levels, and that the situation is, is already looking quite difficult in terms of refugee access to education. And then, of course, when it comes to digging into what that looks like from a gender perspective, I think what we've seen, and this came out in the last UNHCR education report published in 2023, is that there is actually now a greater degree of parity between male and female access rates for refugee learners. So of the countries where UNHCR reports on enrollment data for refugees, we see that for males at primary level, enrollment rates stood around 63%, whereas for females, they were around 61%. And correspondingly at secondary, there were 36% enrollment rates for males versus 35% enrollment rates for females. So we're at close to parity, but I think these figures hide a lot. And certainly one of the things that they hide is or perhaps hide is the wrong word, but then they don't reveal everything, let's say. So one of the things that isn't revealed is that in some countries we still see an enormous disparity between enrollment rates for boys as opposed to girls. And this is certainly the case in some of the low and middle income countries which host the majority of refugee populations. So at the top line figures, there's, has been some progress, but I think once we dig into that, we still see the many challenges which women and girls face in accessing education. Women, in terms of why UNHCR and other partners in the space prioritize education for women and girls, I mean, there are many reasons, and I won't go through them here. I think many of us are familiar with them, but just to give a very brief kind of as a kind of touch point for us to dive into more details later on. I mean, education of women and girls breaks the cycle of poverty, improves economic inclusion, it narrows disparities, it challenges harmful norms, and it reduces inequalities. And for this reason, the Global Compact on Refugees, signed in 2018, sets out to expand and enhance access of refugees youth to all levels of education. More specifically, it recognizes the importance of measures to strengthen the agency of women and girls, to promote women's economic empowerment, and to support access by women and girls to education, which includes secondary and tertiary education. So that's just a very brief summary of the picture in terms of education when it comes to women and girls. And maybe as we're talking about innovations in education within this meeting, I thought I'd just bring up a couple of interesting data points from digital inclusion for refugee women and girls, because we're seeing in forcibly displaced communities, women and girls also face multiple compounding barriers to their inclusion in the broader digital ecosystem, and they're often excluded in both accessing and using digital technologies. So these challenges stem from highly regulated policy environments to access to SIM registrations, limited access to digital devices, affordability, the lack of or low levels of digital literacy and digital skills, as well as bias and online gender-based violence. So all of these issues in the kind of digital ecosystem or accessing that ecosystem also present a gap or a divide that is opening up between, in terms of gender, I should say, when it comes to access to digital technologies. And overall, again, this picture of access to digital technologies for refugees is more bleak for refugees than national populations. So UNHCR data indicates that globally forcibly displaced people are 50% less likely to have an internet-enabled phone compared to those who have been non-displaced or national populations. And this digital divide is more pronounced among women and girls. So I hope this gives some snapshot for framing the discussion. I really don't want this to be a conversation which focuses on those disadvantages and where that data points us to things, like really heading in the wrong direction, because I think we have seen and we are seeing a lot of innovation in terms of overcoming these gaps in the digital divide, in terms of providing education through the use of technology to women and girls. And that's something we will look to explore in this session. But I just wanted to highlight these points to help us frame the challenge and to locate us in terms of where we need to focus our efforts. So with that, Lauren, I'll hand it back to you to take us forward through the session.
Great, thank you, Francis. The disparities we see show up, which, as you point out, is likely not the full picture, show the need for a lot more momentum. And so many of the problems you're describing are, in fact, surmountable. Access to devices, for example, is not something that we don't know the answer of how to solve. So we'll be tackling the what can be done next. The first question is for Nick Sabato. Let me briefly introduce Nick. He's Senior Director of Education for Humanity at Arizona State University, where he leads ASU's efforts in extending educational access to refugees and communities affected by displacement around the world. He serves on behalf of ASU as co-lead of the Connected Learning and Crisis Consortium alongside the UN Refugee Agency in developing collaborative programs that prepare refugee learners to meet their educational ambitions. So he's well placed to answer my question, which is, in situations where the regular delivery of education is interrupted, whether due to emergencies or to crisis or conflict or to situations like that in Afghanistan where the state actually denies access to education, what existing models are promising? Can you tell us about any concepts that could be replicated or scaled that we should be paying attention to?
Well, thanks so much, Lauren, for the question, and thank you everyone for having me, and to all the attendees for spending some time devoted to this important topic. So I'm humbled to be amongst this group, and I'm excited to share a perspective, mostly focused on the higher education component, as that's where a lot of our work is grounded, and drawing on some of our experience both from the Arizona State University experience, as well as that of the Connected Learning and Crisis Consortium. So to answer your question specifically about concepts that can be replicated, scaled, I think it needs to be underpinned kind of in sum, and looking at models that are reflective of the context in which education is being offered. So as can be seen, I think there's going to be differences between models that are being implemented in places like Zatari Camp Jordan, in places like Kampala in kind of an urban center, or in a place like Afghanistan, where there's policy restrictions toward access to education. And so kind of underpinning any successful model or concept is taking into account the situation in which the learners find themselves both yearning to gain access to education, as well as what's possible for how best that they can access that. So in general, these concepts and models are extremely reliant on partnerships. So looking at how an individual organization can partner with local organizations, with government ministries where possible, with international organizations to provide a wide range of services that support learners in a holistic manner. So particularly in the case of learning via technology, technology is often just one part of the entire experience. And so looking at how you can build or design a program that leverages support for the learner on a holistic level. As we all know, learning is more than just showing up and experiencing or absorbing information. And so being able to design a program that supports learners from the moment they consider interest in an educational pathway to what it looks like well after they finish the particular educational offering is really critical in building a successful model or foundation. And so obviously, again, with in the past 5 years, we've seen a dramatic change in the concepts and models that have been espoused to offer support to refugee displaced communities, particularly around the access for women and girls. And so COVID being a big part of that brought to the fore how best digital technologies can be used. And I know we'll spend a bit the effect of having quality digital interventions and the ability to support the learner in accessing those course offerings and different components. And so being able, again, to leverage some of those partnerships and opportunities make the online experience all the more powerful, enabling women and girls and other learners indeed to be able to access a variety of courses and progress through that in a much more streamlined fashion. And also just understanding that different learners have different desires and ambitions for accessing education. And so some may be desiring to gain some skills in order to proceed in a particular vocational pathway. Some learners may be desiring to have degree pathways or obtain different certifications. And so making sure that your program is reflective of those desires and ambitions, not only looking at the types of courses being offered, but also the vehicle by which they are offered, whether that be in-person, facilitated, or online entirely. And so a couple examples, just first drawing from our experience at Arizona State University and the Education for Humanity Initiative. We've been around for the last 7 years, really with a mandate to extend educational access to refugees around the world. And so at the onset or inception of our initiative, we at least had the foresight to speak with learners themselves, as well as implementing partners in refugee context to understand what the design is, or what the desire is rather, as well as what the possibilities are in different contexts. And so we came in and started in speaking with a number of learners in Jordan about the opportunities that they have for education, what their ambitions are in terms of degree pathways, certifications, or gaining skills, and came away with one primary offering that was of interest to nearly everybody, and that was English language. And so this wasn't going to initially be part of our portfolio, but now designing our program with that as kind of a bridge component that opens a doorway to a number of different pathways, whether it be vocational or educational in nature, has been really critical in our meeting the demands and desires of learners, and subsequently their success in the courses themselves. And so this kind of underpins, I guess, a model or a concept that, again, it sounds obvious, but it's harder in practice to design a program that meets or is grounded in the ambitions of learners themselves. Speaking from the perspective of the Connected Learning and Crisis Consortium, of which ASU and UNHCR are co-leads, but is a network of 40 plus organizations that range from higher education institutions to international NGOs and foundations, and local grassroots organizations, all focused on the offering of high quality education in areas of conflict. I'm going to go through 3 quick examples that just kind of show a diversity of concepts that have proven to be successful and sustainable over time, and can serve perhaps as a model for helping expand access for women, girls in these areas of displacement. In northern Jordan, Luminous Technical University College focuses on TVET, technical vocational training for refugees and nationals to be able to proceed with vocational pathways specifically. And so this is a significant opportunity for Syrian refugees in particular to be able to access what is a higher education opportunity in a scholarship component that enables them to then have increased self-reliance and embark upon professional pathways that would have otherwise not been available to them. And so this is underpinned with both online and in-person training that really is reflective of the desires, ambitions of refugees themselves, and is of course open and prioritizes parity in terms of gender inclusion. Uh, going south to Rwanda in Kiziba camp, Kepler is another organization that offers degree pathways to refugees who are within the Kiziba camp specifically. These degree pathways are supported by Southern New Hampshire University and is complemented by job placement training and efforts to help make sure that refugees not only are able to embark upon a degree pathway, but then also be able to gain skills for things like resume writing, things like interview skills, and ways in which that they can then succeed beyond simply the attainment of education itself. And so utilizing technology to offer online courses that enable degree attainment, and then also the job component really has proven to be a really successful model in the Kiziba camp area in Rwanda. And then finally, kind of a different model that just want to mention, again, reflective of the diversity of organizations. Mosaic is an NGO that is focused really on training refugees and helping refugee students prepare to take advantage of already existing scholarship opportunities and indeed job placement opportunities around the world. And so being able to provide a lot of training resources and guidance to refugees on how best to succeed with opportunities that already exist. And that goes also for teachers and teacher training opportunities that help the teachers and facilitators in refugee contexts to continue to professionally develop themselves and their skills. And so these are just kind of three examples in addition to the one mentioned about ASU that I think can serve as a model or a concept that is reflective of context and reflective of ambition while utilizing a number of resources to help learners be most successful. So thank you so much, Lauren, and back to you.
Great. Thank you for these very specific examples. This is exactly what I was yearning to hear. And context matters a lot, and responsive design, as you mentioned, but we can also draw nuggets of inspiration from specific models in one context for another. So I appreciate the three examples you shared with us. And interesting, the popularity of English as well. We had the same experience. We surveyed women in Afghanistan and asked them what subjects were of interest to them for digital learning opportunities, and English was by far at the top of the list. But at the same time, it was also one of 36 or more different subjects they named. So as you said, there's a great need for having multiple pathways. People have many different goals, and there needs to be a really rich menu of options for everyone. You mentioned degree pathways. That's another finding that we've had as well, that women want recognition for their learning. So a recognized credential is such a critical component, but often one that's left out. And you mentioned the need to account for the whole pathway, education and what it's intended to lead to. Education that sets people on a pathway to the livelihood that they're after, because ultimately people want to overcome their situation and they're looking for an education that's going to do that for them. Quality access, you hit on so many critical points. So thanks very much for that comprehensive response. And I want to ask the same question to Francis. I'll go ahead and repeat the question. So in situations where the regular delivery of education is interrupted, whether due to emergencies or to crisis or conflict or to situations like that in Afghanistan, where the state actually denies access to education, what existing models are promising? And can you tell us about any concepts that could be replicated or scaled that we should be paying attention to? So over to you, Francis.
Yeah, and thanks so much to Nick actually for really pointing out some great examples. I'm going to focus initially, and I'll try and keep my answers short and to the point. But I'll try and focus initially on the last part of that question, which is on the replication and the scaling piece, because I think this is a challenge for all of us who are working in this space of trying to provide innovation in education for those who've been displaced by conflict, especially women and girls. And there's a few things that I think it's important to point out on replication and scale. The first one I won't labor on because it's something you just mentioned, Lauren, around while we may look for replication, we also have to really emphasize the relevance of the context. And I think, talking about the higher education perspective, this is really important, right? Where if you have particularly universities delivering courses across international borders, that they're not just taking content and kind of delivering it the same in one country as another, that particularly in a refugee hosting context, it has to be adapted to be relevant. So if you're running a course on healthcare, for example, in the USA, there are parts of that course that can be adapted and used in a refugee setting, but just copy paste the whole course and it may not be relevant to the context in which it's delivered in. I think when it comes to scale, this is a question that we've grappled with a lot at UNHCR, and I know many of us will be grappling with as well. And I should probably point here to some really useful public goods which UNHCR has produced under what was called the Humanitarian Education Accelerator. I'll drop a note in the chat at some point, which really goes into detail around how to scale education innovation with a focus on gender with some of these innovations. I think a critical point is engagement with governments, but also engagement with UNHCR. For innovations to scale, there needs to be some alignment with the national system. Often there's an expectation that government budgets will pick up innovation, but that's not always realistic and it's not always feasible. And so mapping out that journey from the start is really, really important. I would also emphasize the importance of diverse funding needs and diverse business models. I think when we see a lot of education innovations, including for women and girls, they may often be reliant on a single funding stream, often from a foundation with a specific time limit. And so we would really encourage those involved to think about, well, what does this journey look like 10 years out rather than just 3 years out? And is there a business model which can be adapted, which can make it sustainable? Obviously, with any journey to scale or thinking about replication, rigorous evidence review, testing, research, failing, testing again, that process of design, of redesign is really critical, and having the right evidence points in place and the learning points on that journey is really important. And then so those are just a couple of a few points I'd raise on the journey to scale and thinking about replicability. I fully agree with what Nit said on the importance of refugee leadership when it comes to the meaningful participation, especially for women and girls. At UNHCR, we've seen some really great work around this actually through what we call the Digital Gender Inclusion and Innovation Bootcamp, which works with grassroots organizations, women-run organizations, on tackling challenges such as online safety, access to education, gender stereotypes, digital literacy, and access to devices. But it's fundamentally based around the idea of trying to channel resources and technical know-how into the hands of female-led grassroots organizations and allowing females to take the lead. And I think that's a really critical approach when it comes to innovation. Again, fully agree with Nick on the focus on livelihoods, especially with women and girls, and building financial independence. And I would also point to some really innovative examples or some really useful examples of support for female learners with caring that have been used when we've seen education innovations previously. This could be caring of kids, support with maternity leave for young mothers, or with a creche or a nursery that can take care of their kids while they're learning. But also, I think we would emphasize the importance of cash. Like I think previously there have been initiatives which looked at things like distribution of sanitary pads or other items around, food security or whatever it may be. But we find, and this is the approach that UNHCR uses with its higher education scholarship, the DAFI program, the transfer of cash to refugee women and girls can really help build independence and choice, especially when it comes to education. So I think that's something we would really encourage organizations to look at. And certainly one of our partners who worked in this space under the Humanitarian Education Accelerator transferred away from a kind of distribution of products to a distribution of cash approach when it came to supporting women and girls in education because of that promotion of independence, and they saw it as a far more successful way of doing that. So with that, Lauren, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Francis, for all of these points and for highlighting the need for localization. Something I'd certainly echo, and alignment. This is something that can be left at the wayside, especially in contexts of crisis where you're just trying to get programs up and running, and it can be hard to be thinking far down the line to the alignment needed for sustainability. On the other hand, in crisis, you see innovation happen, and the trick is to sustain it and scale it. And this whole scaling business is a little bit of a new science in some ways, where the sector is just beginning to think methodically about how it happens. So we will shortly turn to the next question, but does anyone of our panelists have anything to add on anything to do with this first question? Just go ahead and unmute if anyone else has any final points here. Okay, hearing none, I'm going to turn to the second question, which is also for Nick. So how can digital resources be utilized to bridge the education gap for refugee and displaced women, especially in areas with limited in-person educational opportunities?
Great, thanks so much. And I'll be a bit brief with this response, but it's obviously a critical question and one that I think we're all kind of excitedly addressing as much as possible, because digital opportunities open up a wealth of opportunities in areas for individuals for whom education is limited, and certainly this applies directly to women and girls specifically, and this has been the case for a long time, figuring out ways in which, regardless of context, there are different barriers facing women and girls to accessing education, particularly once we get to a secondary and higher education component, as different family responsibilities and expectations change, different competing priorities. And so online and digital education really presents an enormous opportunity to fit in and complement with one's personal life, to be able to enable them to continue to pursue education and achieve their desired and stated ambitions. And so and this digital education and online education offers different opportunities, whether access is limited by policy, as in the case in Afghanistan, or by infrastructure. And so individuals can be able to access education from mobile phones, from tablets, at computer centers, in other ways, to gain particular skills, whether it be language acquisition or some technical ability, whether there's coding boot camps that we're very aware of all over the world, as well as other skills that are being built on the back of digital education and online access. Degree attainment, as I alluded to in the first example, is also increasingly accepted, and the stigma around online education is increasingly decreasing, in part due to COVID, but also certainly because the quality of online education has been proven time and time again to be of the utmost importance to many institutions, and I think there are a huge number of organizations that are offering online education that is at the level or higher than in-person education. And so that's becoming widely accepted. And finally, again, pointing to the kind of labor market access, digital work continues to be on the rise. So individuals, regardless of context, again, able to access the labor market using digital skills, doing freelance consultancies, doing some of their skills that have been obtained to be able to participate in kind of the global economic structure through digital work itself. So obviously, it's a door opener. Digital resources being a bridge, and so a common issue around all this and a challenge that we're all trying to address is the fact that connectivity in itself is a spectrum, and so in many cases there may be connectivity, but it may be either limited or unreliable, and so makes programmatic implementation challenging. Not to mention for an individual spending time and allocating resources to attend a course, to carve out time in one's day to access some sort of digital training, that unreliability can be challenging. And so many organizations are trying to address this with increasing opportunities for refugee and displaced women and others to access education without connectivity, without electricity, or with unreliable assets of both. And so this is an ever evolving model that can bring digital education to individuals wherever they are, particularly if traditional access is limited or not possible. A couple examples, again, trying to ground things from the ASU perspective. We're doing a couple of different pilot programs that utilize technology to enable access to our digital courses without internet access, or can be accessed without or with access. And so have done so in South Lebanon and are doing so also in Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Thailand as well, with really grand ambition to be able to address the opportunities that Frankie spoke about in his opening remarks about the number of individuals, particularly women and girls, that have no access to internet connectivity. With specific regard to Afghanistan as well, noting that alongside our hosts here, Canadian Women for Women of Afghanistan and UNHCR, we're part of an alliance for education of women in Afghanistan. And within this alliance, there's a number of organizations that are already in pursuit of digital offerings, assets, and opportunities that enable the communities within Afghanistan to have access to digital courses despite limitations, both from policy, from infrastructure, and from general access. And so these solutions are already in progress, and I'm sure many of you that are part of this, part of the audience here are well familiar and oftentimes more familiar than I am. But these are just a few different examples of ways in which digital technology can be really an important lever in increasing access. But again, just to underscore from our experience, just wanting to focus on the importance of designing a holistic approach. So despite the prominence of digital technology, ed tech solutions, and the prominence of the digital ability to provide access, the success of programs and success of learners is going to be dependent upon having a holistic and comprehensive solution that uses the technology as a tool that enables access, but also recognizing that the individual learner needs full support, whether that be from transportation, whether that be from, as Frankie noted, financial resources are an important component as connectivity is often expensive, and as well as just support and motivation for students. So whether that be facilitation, whether that be WhatsApp groups, or Signal groups, Telegram groups that are able to provide support for learners as they proceed in digital courses that make them feel like they're part of a cohort, part of a program, and keep them engaged and supported reduce attrition, but also then to provide encouragement for those students and others that can continue to make progress in their academic studies. So digital learning, obviously huge opportunity, but underscoring the fact that it is one part of kind of a responsible programmatic implementation guideline that I think the most successful models have chosen to prioritize. So thank you, Lauren, back to you.
Great, thanks, Nick. Yeah, this transformation of the quality and perception of quality of virtual education has been really remarkable in the past, I guess, couple of decades, and also within that, the opportunity for things like access to really specialized training that might not, be available in a particular geographic area. And I'm glad you brought up the Alliance. We're, I think, around 45 organizations or so now, and there's different working tracks and thematic tracks, and one is the medical education track. And so that's a great example where you have, very, very specialized areas, and now Afghan women studying medicine can connect with specialists all over the world. So yeah, really great example of what digital access can do in those circumstances. So Francis, I want to ask you the same question. If you have anything to add to the question of how can digital resources be utilized to bridge the education gap for refugee and displaced women?
Not much to add because I think Nick was very comprehensive, but maybe I'll just touch on a couple of points to try to help people conceptualize in their head what these opportunities might look like. When we're talking about digital education for displaced women, like what does that actually look like? And I think to point out firstly that, like often where we find this, especially with refugee populations and where they're located in a country, they may face significant both logistical barriers but also policy barriers that would prevent them from accessing any kind of post-secondary learning opportunities. So when we think of what education looks like in those types of communities, often it's in the border region. As I said, with limited access to resources, we have to really think creatively. And, thinking about like the provision of offline first capabilities. I mean, this is an approach that UNHCR uses a lot with our work in what we call connected education. I know ASU do as well. So trying to make sure that you have educational content that's available both offline and online, and that is very light touch when it comes to the use of energy or power. I think this kind of technology can help make learning available on the margins, especially for women and girls. And I often like to, when we work with our partners, to try and conceptualize that work in three ways in terms of what it looks like. One is where often we'll have the provision of learning in the refugee community through a community learning center. So whether it's in a refugee settlement or an urban area or in a refugee camp, sometimes it will be UNHCR run, sometimes it will be partner run. There will be a connected learning center within that, which, as I mentioned, it has a kind of offline first capability. And then we invite education partners or universities to collaborate around the provision of learning at that center. We encourage universities delivering education across borders to try and collaborate with national universities, especially on issues like accreditation, which you had mentioned, Lauren, as being critical. So that's one approach. I think the second approach is purely online, which maybe in the past we had, we were a bit more skeptical of a purely online approach. And I think for women and girls, it has certain challenges, particularly around access to devices and connectivity and things like this. And we had traditionally seen high rates of dropouts from these types of programs. But I think over the past 2 or 3 years, perhaps, let's say maybe a bit longer, we've seen some fully online programs that are starting to work really, really well. So I think a lot has been learned in that space. And a lot has a lot. There's a lot of help from the advances in technology, particularly technology in low resource environments. And I think particularly thinking of a context like Afghanistan, that mode of delivery may be the most optimal. And finally, we have connected learning, which is based in a local institution, which may be near a refugee camp or refugee settlement or urban area where refugees live, where there's a kind of blended approach, where they may have access to the campus 2 or 3 days a week and then study online 2 or 3 days a week. So I think these are the kind of modalities which may help displaced women in terms of accessing higher education or even post-secondary education or upper secondary in terms of what it looks like. I think I'll just throw in one more point, or two more points. One is around the need for skills. So this is coming through in research that UNHCR has done recently around the gender skills gap for displaced women and girls, and really needing to, with these innovation programs, focus on that improvement of that level of skills to be able to access these programs. And also to focus on the social element of learning and the social emotional element of learning as well. And this is obviously critical with displaced populations in general, and creating a safe social space which is accessible, particularly when setting up a learning center where these innovative education practices might take place. I think that's really important to emphasize because it's something we haven't touched on thus far. But with that, I'll hand it back to you, Lauren.
Great, thanks very much, Frankie. So I want to ask the next question to Lauren. First, I'll introduce her. Great name, by the way. Lauren Gherkin is gender coordinator for INEE, for the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies. That's an absolutely fabulous organization. So if you've not checked them out before, I encourage you to look up INEE, and they have a lot of great resources on their website. So Lauren leads INEE's work on gender and girls' education in emergencies. She coordinates the INEE Gender Working Group, produces and hosts the Educate Us podcast, and manages the Mind the Gap report and policy paper series on girls' education in crisis and conflict. So Lauren, how can we support a human rights-centered, gender-responsive approach to education delivery in crisis-affected settings where states cannot or will not deliver on legally enshrined responsibilities?
Thanks, Lauren, from one Lauren to another. So first and foremost, as civil society, as NGOs, as education stakeholders at all levels, we really have a responsibility to advocate for states to fulfill their duty to provide quality education for all. And that is including girls, boys, gender diverse children and youth, learners with disabilities, overage learners, pregnant and parenting learners, rural and displaced learners, everybody. We really need to center gender equity and disability inclusion in conversations around education quality. Because I'm seeing sometimes those conversations sort of being moved to the margins and treated as like as a checkbox, oh, girls are included. But really, you cannot say that education is of quality if it's not accessible, if it's not relevant to the most marginalized learners, and those are often adolescent girls and children with disabilities. But to come back to your question, I think there's a bit of a distinction to be made between supporting in settings where states cannot versus will not provide gender responsive, human rights centered education. If it's will not, if it's a matter of political will, then civil society has a really important role to play in shifting that mindset, in pushing for institutional change, in ensuring that women and girls have space at the decision-making table and are able to inform policies that affect them. And in this current political climate where there is so much pushback against women's rights, against sexual and reproductive health and rights, there's a lot of advocacy work to be done at all levels. But even given the scale of the need, I do really want to highlight the work that women's organizations and feminist youth organizations are already doing at the grassroots level. There are so many examples of incredible advocacy and movement building around women's rights, around girls' education and sexual and reproductive health that have been done by youth-led organizations, by women-led organizations, and we should be learning from them and amplifying their work. We need to be connecting them with decision makers, supporting them to lead discussions rather than just participate in them, and making sure that they are getting the credit and the funding that they deserve for the incredible work they're already doing. So that's will not. If it cannot, if it's a matter of capacity, whether that is lack of knowledge or skills or infrastructure, then non-state actors again have an important role to play in supporting governments to identify gaps, to strengthen capacity, to advocate for more or more sustainable funding. And over the last several years, there's been an explosion of new tools and resources on how to plan for, implement, and assess gender-responsive education in emergencies. There are tools on gender-responsive education sector planning from UNGAI and GPE, on gender-responsive pedagogy from PLAN, on recruiting and retaining female teachers from UNGAI, ECW, and INEE in the EIE Gen Kit, on GBV risk mitigation in education from the cluster in their new learning brief. So while crises are overwhelming in their number and scale and severity, no one has to start totally from scratch when they're planning now. There are so many examples of good practice that have already been highlighted today. So many examples of good practice and gender responsive EIE that are available and can be adapted and implemented in new crises. But as a community, we need to come together to make sure that those tools are accessible, that they're contextualized, that they're relevant, that folks are supported to use them, and that there is, again, sustainable funding to roll them out. But, always a but, changing mindsets and policies and systems, these are all things that take time. And while systems are adapting, we need to make sure that children and youth aren't falling through the cracks. They aren't missing out on education in situations where formal education may not be available or accessible. So in the interim, there are some promising opportunities in distance education and non-formal education. I won't talk too much about distance education because we've already had so many great examples. But just to say that even in situations where digital education may not be accessible, where women and girls in particular may not have access to connectivity or to devices, there are other kinds of programming you can still do for distance education. In many contexts, that would ideally be a mix of low-tech and no-tech solutions. For example, combining printed learning materials with interactive radio instruction that's repeated multiple times a day so that girls may have access at different times. It could be individual or small group tutoring sessions in community spaces. There's been a lot of success as well with using community workers and peer learning groups, both to maintain contact with girls and their family and monitor their well-being, as well as ensuring that they're continuing to learn while they're outside of the formal education system. And then broadly on gender responsive non-formal education, there's been so much innovation around flexible opportunities. So education that's accounting for other constraints on girls' time, like domestic labor and childcare, interventions that include childcare or ECD components so that young mothers are able to continue their education while knowing that their children are safe and cared for. There are programs that take place in that are meeting girls where they're already at in terms of in time and location. So taking places in places that communities already consider safe for girls, like community centers or in communities leaders' houses. Programs that are taking a whole child approach. So addressing learners' needs holistically, because you can't neatly divide your health needs and your education needs and your nutrition needs up into neat little sectoral boxes. They all interact with each other, and we have to treat people like people rather than sort of a collection of needs and desires. And that involves coordinating comprehensively with sectors like health and nutrition and WASH. there are a bunch of really great examples of peer learning and peer mentorship programs that can support girls to build confidence and leadership skills, programs that are co-designed with children and youth to make sure that they're addressing the skills that young people feel they actually need to thrive in their context, rather than us deciding for them what skills we think that they would need. In many cases, that involves links to TVET and gender responsive TVET, so not sort of not putting young women or young men into boxes, into gender specific boxes of what kind of professions we think are going to be most common for women or for men. So for example, electrician programs or carpentry programs for young women. And then, as it has been brought up so many times already, these programs ideally need to be accredited and aligned to national curricula so that learners are ready and prepared to rejoin formal education systems if or when that becomes possible. And the exciting thing is that these programs have the potential not only to maintain the progress of learners who had previously been in school, but they also present new opportunities to enroll those who were out of school before crises. So connecting them with accelerated education programs or vocational training, as many just different flexible opportunities for young women, for young men, for gender diverse children, so that we can ensure that they are continuing to learning as the system or as policymakers are catching up. So I'll stop there and I will hand back over to you, Lauren.
Great, thanks. I'm furiously taking notes. Lots of great ideas here. Yeah, I appreciate the focus on choice and variety and having options for different people. And I'm glad you emphasized quality. So often the discourse gets focused on access, but the legal definition of the right to education includes both access and content. So when we advocate for the right to education, we need to be mindful that both elements are included. You mentioned the importance of supporting local grassroots efforts. This certainly resonates for me with our vantage point in Afghanistan. There's so much incredible initiative underway there. And there's this really rapidly growing community of organizations, or they're not always necessarily organizations, informal groups, usually volunteer-based, without funding, doing really remarkable work, but not connected to international networks. And not accessing international resources, and in turn, their expertise is not being accessed. So yeah, lots to think about. You've given us a lot to work with, and I'd like to ask the same question to Hawa, but first I'll introduce her. So Hawa Abdiaziz is communication coordinator at She Leads Kakuma. She's based in Nairobi. Hawa actively participates in Transform Education, an initiative hosted by the United Nations Girls Education Initiative. She is also a member of the Refugee Education Council, contributing to the advancement of education for refugees. Hawa's involvement extends to co-leading the Girls Education in Emergencies Working Group, an integral part of the Secondary Education Working Group. In addition, she takes on a leadership role in She Leads Kakuma, a leadership, mentorship, and advocacy program for young women and girls in the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. So how can we ensure a human rights-centered, gender-responsive approach to education delivery in crisis-affected settings where states cannot or will not deliver on legally enshrined responsibilities? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And I would like to thank everyone who joined us today, the attendees and the panelists as well, and the speakers who are all here. And every time I have such the conferences or the such meetings, or every time we have it, I come to realize that I learn new things because I keep meeting new people who come up with new ideas or new resolutions for the problems that we are having. We always talk about the same issues. We always talk about the same problems. Lauren went through almost everything that I had to go through. Thank you so much, Lauren. So first of all, let me introduce myself once again. My name is Hawa Abdiaziz. I was born in a refugee camp based in Nairobi, the coastal part of Kenya. I was brought up in refugee, so I kept moving from one refugee camp to another. I lived in Marafa, I lived in Dadaab, I lived in Hagader, and I also lived in Kakuma. But I'm actually now based in Nairobi. So I went for my university. Luckily, I went to study in Turkey, where I graduated last year with bachelor's degrees of media and journalism. I come from a family of 8 girls. I'm the last born, and I'm the only one who graduated from university who has a degree. I was brought up and I was also born in a refugee camp. So I know every problem that everyone here is talking about. And everyone around the world now is trying to come up with a solution. Everyone, like, we're trying to come together as team and being like, you know what, we have to solve problem A, B, C, D. You know what they say? Now we already solved most of the problem, 99%. What was that 99%? We came up with the problem. That was the main issue. The main issue now is the problem. Now, what is the part of the organizations, the governments, the local NGOs that we have? What are their roles? Now, their roles is only to solve the problem that we come with, and we be like, hey, this is what we are going through. This is the problem I have. This is as a refugee girl who was brought up in Kakuma refugee camp and Dadaab. I think ABCD is what we are going through. And I think you can solve doing this and this. So they only have to do 1%. And that 1% is to solve the problem that you presented. So the absence of the state support, I think, one of the things that we really see and we can really do is like we see the local communities, and we have a lot of youth-led organizations often play a big role. I am one of those youth-led organizations. It's called Shiris Kakuma. It's based in Kakuma. And also, I'm sorry, English is my third language, so I might be missing some words. The organization that we run, it's called Shiris Kakuma. We do mentorship programs, we do leadership programs for young girls that are based now in Kakuma only, not in Dadaab, only in Kakuma at the moment. So if I came up with that problem and I'd be like, hey, I have this organization. Now the organization, now what is it doing? I do mentorship programs, I do leadership programs, I make sure the girls who are behind me, who didn't have the chance that I actually had and I have right now to go to school, to go to high school, to go to university, they don't have the same luck. Why? Because there's a lot of stereotypes where I come from, especially the Somali community. We believe that as a young girl or as a woman in the community, your job is only to be a housewife. Unfortunately, it's 2024, but we still have the same mindset. I still have some friends, close friends, some family members who never went to school. Why? Because the parents believe that, she is a lady, she is a woman. At the end of the day, she will belong to the kitchen. Lauren talked about educating our own parents. We can educate our parents. We can have the communities coming together and creating these small projects that instead of, we already have youth organizations that is, empowered. We do everything that we can do to make sure every woman in the society is included in decision making. Now we have our own parents, our own guardians who don't know what we are doing. So I think it's important to have the small communities coming together and be like, hey, I think we can come together today and have, some people or some group educating our parents. I cannot force any parents or to know them, it's important for a lady or for a woman or for a young girl to go to school. At the end of the day, they say when you educate a woman or a girl, you educate a whole nation. You're educating a whole family. I'm educated thanks to my mother. I'm really educated. Now, if today I have children, do you think I will be like, no, I don't think my children, they will need, not to go to school? No, because I know the importance of education. Sometimes we have the education in the camps. We have them, yes. But is it quality education? No. Do we have enough textbooks in the schools? No. Do we have trained teachers in the schools? No. Is there safety for girls to walk past certain time to go to study? I remember when I was in class 8, I was doing my KCP, I remember when I wanted to go to school after a certain time, and I was in Kakuma, and you could hear people saying, that time I was from Nairobi, so I moved back to Kakuma again. They will say no, because there is no girl outside. I think it was after 3 p.m. or after, I don't know, 4 p.m. You can be outside. And I was like, I want to revise with my friends or maybe go to school. The school was very close to my house. They'd be like, no. So in the morning, when I go to the school, I will find the boys somewhere even sleeping in the school. Like, they literally made a boarding school in the school, so they could even go past certain time to the school. And I was like, what is happening? Because there is no safety for girls. People believe that you can walk past certain time and you have to stick with that one. Another thing is, I think we should also ensure inclusion of both girls and women for those affected communities. We have to make sure, if you want to make a decision for Kakuma, or if you want to make a decision for Afghanistan, or if you want to make a decision for Dadaab, I think we cannot just have people who has never experienced what we are experiencing, or we cannot have people who have never seen what we are. I have seen it. I know how girls are treated. I know the stereotypes. I know the norms of what is happening between the South Sudan, between the Somali community, Eritrean, Ethiopian, Afghanistan. I know what is happening. So when we have the decision making, I think we should have the youth, people who actually know what is happening back home, so that we can tell you, this is happening, we need this and this. And that should be easy work for everyone, for us and for the organizations, for the governments and for the policies, everyone who is ruling that host refugee countries that we actually staying. And I think another thing is, to answer the question, is we should, one important thing that we don't do is, and the government and the organizations don't do, is data collection and monitoring. They should have, I think Francis or Rosie Nick talked about this. We should have the data collection for, how many actually girls are going to school in Kakuma. There are 1,000 girls in Kakuma, for example, but we have like 500 girls only reporting to school, high school, primary, and colleges. Where are the rest of the girls? What is happening to them? That's a good question. We are 1,000, but only 500 are reporting back to school. We don't know where the rest of the 500 are. Or maybe we have 1,000, but the classrooms we have, or the schools we have, very small. You see us one small classroom, 1,000 of students sharing it. Some are sitting down, some are outside learning from the window. I have experienced that, and I have seen that with my own naked eyes, learning from the windows. Why? Because the organizations, UNHCR is responsible for Kakuma. We have a lot of other organizations being there. We have the Kenyan government. How I am seeing that? How comes that nobody else is seeing that? Don't you think those students, they will enjoy maybe a bigger classroom? It doesn't have to be a fancy classroom that the rest of the world has it, but at least a comfortable classroom that will make sure this student at least have something when they go back home. And I think we can work towards ensuring that all individuals, regardless of their circumstances, and have access to quality education that promotes their dignity, empowerment, and well-being. And education is for everyone. Thank you so much. Back to you, Lauren, I think. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Lauren. Thanks so much. How your perspective is really necessary for this discussion. You've lived through these policies and practices, or efforts at policies and practices. You brought up the necessity and utility of engagement with families. That's so critical. And really, engagement with whole societies often is necessary. The need for effective communication as part of change efforts. Evidence and data collection, we can't do much to improve efforts if it's not being effectively measured. And this can't be an afterthought. It's something that has to be built into programs from start to finish. That's part of their design, which would support accountability, something else you raised. And practicalities like distance. Yes, there may be a school in the city, but if it's not in the camp, it may as well not exist as far as young women or girls are concerned. They may not be able to access it, whether due to distance or safety or lack of transport or social restrictions. So these have to be thought through when it comes to ensuring that there's gender equitable access. So Hawa, the next question is also one I'd like to ask you. There continue to be large refugee populations on the move and migration, with many displaced people and migrants moving through multiple countries over long periods of time as they seek durable solutions. So an experience I think is relatable for you. Do you have any thoughts on the internationalization of education? How is the portability of credentials being addressed, or how could it be addressed? How can we best respond to the need for borderless education in a world full of borders?
Thank you so much. To go back, I will not go back again to the story or Kakuma of the Dab. I will not go back. So I think we could involve this by developing, international frameworks or agreements between, the host refugee countries and the neighboring country that the host the refugees are coming. For example, I live in Kenya right now, and in Kakuma we have more than 200,000 people living, a lot of nationalities. We have the South Sudan, we have Eritreans, we have Somalis, we have people from DRC. We also have now people from Afghanistan. We have them there. So when people are moving from their homeland countries and they are running for safety and they are coming to the host refugee countries like Kenya, they are coming, do you think someone will even remember to carry their high school diploma or their primary school diploma? No. The only thing people will remember is what you are wearing and maybe what you will eat on the way. And then you run away, you come away safe. Nobody runs away from home unless home it's a mouth of shark. So people run away. By the time they are reaching where it's safe, nobody has documents. I was in Kakuma, I think 2 weeks ago, and I met I met few girls there who are from Ethiopia and some were from Somalia. One of them was 18 and the other one was 20. So they were not going to school. So I asked them, they were a friend of a friend. And I was like, why do you guys go to school? The normal conversation that you have with the peers. And the girl and they both were like, no, we don't go to school. And I was like, why? Why is that? And one of them told me when they came from Somalia and they came to Kenya, that was like, I think 3 years ago, they had their high school diploma. But by the time they reached here in Kenya, they wanted back to report maybe high school to continue with, Form 2 or Form 3. Sometimes education might be different from Somalia or from any other country to Kenya. Every country has their own policies in education. They all have that. And the girls told me they couldn't go back to school. Reason number one, because their papers were not accepted in Kenya here. So they were told, if you actually want to report back to high school, you have to go back to class 8, do the KCP. We have an examination called KCP for you to pass to high school. So they were told to go back to KCP, and then that's when you will start Form 1. And mind you, they were Form 3, Form 4 in Somalia. So she told me, it was no need. Why do I have to go back to class 8 to be, and then behind for another 3 years, and then be a class 8 and then Form 1? So they told me it was not worth it anymore. So what they were doing was just, they just opened a small business, 18 years old, 20 years old girls, very young, super young girls. So I think one main thing that can be done is to create that equivalence diploma from a certain country to the host refugee countries, so that when people come, at least what they have to do is maybe an examination showing that this person is qualified, to be in high school or to be in, in primary. Mathematics is the same everywhere in the world. Chemistry is the same. Physics is the same. Nothing changes. Maybe the only thing that will change is the language. There's no Swahili in other countries. There's no French everywhere. But there's mathematics, chemistry, English, biology, everything is the same. So I think during those examinations, having one nomination and being like, if you do this examination and you pass, well and good, you will go back to where you are. But if we say no, that means that people who come to seek safety will not go back to school anymore, and there will never be a lot of, especially girls, those are the ones who give up easily. whatever is happening in the community, and then people telling you can do this, it's so easy for you just to give up in those host areas. And I think inclusivity, I talked about that as well. With education, curriculum can help prepare every student to thrive in their global environment in everywhere they go. I also talked about that. So by working together, we can remove the barriers and promote inclusivity. We can ensure that education remains a fundamental right for everyone. And it's so easy to maintain that. I promise you guys, it's very easy. I think that's all for me, Lauren. Thank you. Once again, back to you.
Thanks. Yeah, listening to you, I mean, it's just incredible to me that the people whom we should be asking less of, we ask more of, to repeat grades. And we know clearly from the research that the longer someone is out of school, the less likely they will be to ever get back. So there's this really critical window, and so often it gets shut. So my next question is, and it's one for all of the panelists, when programs work and displaced populations, and in particular displaced women and girls, regain access to education where they are, what is gained? So I'm going to ask very brief answers because I see we're getting close to time, and we hopefully will have some time for questions from the floor. So we'll start with you, Lauren, for this question.
Sure. So a lot is gained. Firstly, education in emergencies is protective. It provides life-saving and life-sustaining psychosocial, physical, and cognitive support, and it's an entry point for discussions on topics like gender equity and inclusion. Also, education is a right, but it's also a rights multiplier. So educated girls grow up to become productive and informed women who can advocate for their own rights and protect the rights of others. And we see that in a couple of different places. So when women and girls are educated, child mortality and malnutrition rates decrease, knowledge of sexual and reproductive health and rights and safe sex practices increase, rates of early marriage and early pregnancy decrease. Another point is around female teachers. So we can't have educated female teachers if girls aren't finishing secondary school and developing the sort of the minimum requirement in order to attend teacher training programs. And we need more female teachers. They play a huge role in advocating for young women and girls to stay in school, in reassuring communities that girls are safe in school. There are a number of economic arguments. The World Bank estimates that failing to let girls finish their education could cost the world as much as 30 trillion US dollars in lost earnings and productivity annually. That's an unbelievable amount, but you can't expect economies to grow if you're neglecting 50% of human capital of the population. And then finally, there's a link between educating women and girls and peace building. So 4 of the 5 countries with the largest gender gaps in education are conflict affected, and conflict is less likely in contexts where there's gender parity in terms of mean years of schooling. So when education is available equitably, it can be the key to enabling children and youth of all genders to contribute to peace building processes, to advocating for more gender equal societies, and to creating prosperity for all. But one little caveat, so just a tiny word of caution, while it's wonderful that we have all of these amazing statistics on how women and girls are driving changes in public health and peace building and the economy, I just want to caution against necessarily relying on what educated women can do for society as the reason that we use for investing in them and for supporting girls' education. Women and girls should not just be seen as a tool for economic or social progress. They are full people with hopes and dreams and agency, and they shouldn't have to contribute to change in order to earn access to rights like education. They are owed education solely on the basis of being human, and that is our responsibility to ensure that those rights are realized. And I'll hand back over to you, Lauren.
Thanks for making that point. Yeah, I think there's different categories of argument, and some work better than others depending on the audience. But I wish that all audiences responded to that take. So Hawa, let's hear from you next. What do we have to gain if we can connect displaced girls and women to education opportunities?
there is 1,000 of things that you can gain. I think one of the things that I'll just focus like 3 or 4 points. The first thing is we gain empowerment. We get young girls and women empowered in the society. Yay, I can do this. Yeah, I can do that. We will not be giving up. If I can do it today, and I go back to where I come from and I tell them ABCD, we can do it. And I think there is that empowerment that people get every year, every day, every month. We get a lot of young girls reporting back to school, whether being housewives, but they're still going back to school. Why? Because they were empowered and they have seen from social media they can do it. Another thing is there is a lot of improved health and well-being. If you educate girls and women, there will surely be a lot of improved health in the families, because they are the one who take care of the family. That's why we say if you educate a girl, you educate a whole nation. Now you get free health and well-being for the family. And the last one is there is breaking in gender norms. Education challenges traditional genders, norms, and stereotypes by promoting gender equality. Where I come from, Somalis, I told you, we don't believe that. We don't believe girls should go to school or should graduate from university. Still, I have people in my family telling me, what will that degree do for you? What will that master's degree do for you? At the end of the day, you will go back to the kitchen and cook for a man. That's what I hear still. So I think if I wasn't educated, I would have listened to them and I will be like, yes, that is true. I will be, at the end of the day, I will be in the kitchen. But now I'm educated and I get to see great people like you, and I have to meet a lot of other people. And now I am empowered. I think now I'm breaking the gender norms of be like, no, every girl and every woman should do what everyone else in the world is doing. Yeah. Thank you so much, Lauren.
Thank you for that. Your turn, Nick. What are your thoughts?
So I couldn't possibly have much more to add to what Lauren and Hawa said, other than just endorse it completely. Obviously, when programs work, helps individuals directly, has a trickle-down effect on their communities. So siblings, other community members see educational success as a possibility, and therefore pursue it more aggressively. And thirdly, I think when programs work, then information is able to be shared. And other organizations, the sector at large, can learn from that, and then be able to try to replicate in contextualized ways in different areas. So ideally, programs working has somewhat of a cascading effect, that and a multiplier effect, I think, as Lauren said, that enables more programs therefore to work. So that's all I'll say. I really appreciate this type of a session, because I think this is an example of that, and I'm really grateful for your organization of it. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Nick. And finally, Francis, let's hear from you on this.
Again, not much to add. Maybe just to say, I mean, I think it's been very comprehensive from Hawa and Lauren. But one thing to add perhaps is through education, especially for refugee girls and women, it opens up access to what we call solutions. So this can be access to third country opportunities through education pathways, or to return to the countries which refugees has fled, and successful return to those countries. And we know that, you know, higher education, or the higher the level of education, the more successful the return, but also integration into the host community. So I think that's something that we can add in terms of what we benefit from educating young refugee women and girls.
All right, thanks, Francis. This has been extremely energizing, and I think you've all helped us see clearly the great potential out there, and that in fact there's already much to build on. So doing better is entirely within our reach, and there's this growing constellation of actors that's already rolled up their sleeves, creating momentum. And I hope that we can expect to see robust support behind them from the international community, as the response of other states becomes paramount in situations where the obligation to provide education lays unfulfilled by a state actor towards its citizens. In these cases, other states need to step in, and with the support of civil society actors, so we collectively uphold the right to education for all, as the world committed to do when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed, and determined to include the right to education without discrimination. So I think that we are at time. I'm not sure if we want to extend it and take some questions from the audience. Julie, do you should I move on to wrapping up, or do we have time for some questions?
Well, in fact, what we're going to do is we're going to send a link tomorrow to everybody that registered. I've taken a look at some of the questions here, and we'll be answering some of those questions with the information that we share. So if you'd like to wrap up, that would probably be best. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. I'll do that. Yeah, and great questions. I've been trying to follow them throughout the event, so we'll definitely address those when the follow-up info goes out. And a huge thanks for that engagement. And before closing, I have some other thanks to give. So firstly, just to all of you who attended for taking part in this important discussion, and a special thanks, of course, to our speakers for sharing their time, their knowledge, and experience. And I'd also like to say thanks to my colleague Erin for providing technical support for this session today, and to Julie for her tireless efforts organizing behind the scenes. The rest of us just showed up, but for her it was rather more involved. And to all of you, thank you for coming today and for caring about women and girls who are uprooted, who are affected by crisis, by conflict, and whose rights are compromised as a result. We truly appreciate your presence today, and I trust you'll take the discussion forward in your own work and networks from here. So we'll be following up with anyone who registered for the event with the link to the recording of it on our YouTube channel, and links to our speakers. And just a final thanks for joining us today.